Hey guys, tonight we step softly onto the shores of the Adriatic Sea, where the air smells of brine and the waves carry whispers older than memory. Imagine standing by a medieval Greek harbour, its lamps flickering against dark water, when suddenly, without warning, the faint toll of bells rises from beneath the sea. Not from the chapel behind you, not from the monastery on the headland, but from the drowned depths themselves. You probably won't survive this if you lean too far forward to check, but the story insists that long ago entire bells sank with their city, and they still ring in the deep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The legend of drowned bells is not unique to one coastline, but in medieval Greek memory, the Adriatic tolls were a strange reminder that faith and fear mingle easily. The empire at that time stretched across shifting seas, its sailors ferrying silk salt and stories. Among the cargo they carried were whispers of bells that had slipped beneath the water and yet refused silence. It begins with one city half monastery, half marketplace set against the uncertain tide. The name is blurred in chronicles as if even the scribes were uneasy to write it down, but the outline remains a thriving port that met an abrupt watery end. The Byzantine world was no stranger to disaster. Earthquakes rattled Constantinople often enough that architects developed a special stubbornness when it came to domes. Fires broke out so frequently that citizens joked you could set your stew on the window ledge and wait for the next blaze to cook it. Floods though those carried a more spectral weight. When a building collapsed, people rebuilt. When water claimed an entire quarter of a city, it felt more like divine judgment. And when bells, which marked hours of prayer and moments of alarm, vanished into the sea, but seemed to go on ringing well, that was either a miracle or a nightmare. Historians still argue whether the first reports describe a natural resonance of the waves or genuine superstition written down as fact. The earliest tale of the drowned bells claims that monks heard them during vigils. Picture a monastery on a cliff, candles, wavering voices chanting psalms. Suddenly through the stone and night air, a muffled boom echoes upward like a great bell struck by a hidden hand. The monks, alarmed, stop their singing. Then comes another chime, and another deep and deliberate. They run outside, peering toward the village far below, only to see that no church tower remains. The sea has swallowed it all. Yet still the toll continues, as if someone down there rings the bells for matins. One monk is said to have dropped his candle in terror, muttering, "Hell has found its choir." Modern science suggests that sound can travel in unusual ways beneath water. Some researchers point to the unique geology of the Adriatic seabed, where caverns and ridges may amplify the boom of shifting stones until it mimics a bell. Others note that waves slapping against submerged ruins can create rhythmic tones like wind howling through a hollow flute. But for the medieval mind, that explanation was not only unsatisfying, it was laughably dull. After all, this was an age when even crocodile dung could be recommended as sunscreen, and when the phases of the moon were seen as moody gods rather than rock and reflection. The drowned bells fit perfectly into their worldview, a divine warning echoing through the centuries. One curious addition comes from a fringe chronicle written by a pilgrim from Thessalonica. He claimed that when the bells rang, the fish in the harbour leapt in unison, as though called to worship. He described silver-scaled bodies breaking the surface in rhythm with the tolls, like a congregation rising to its feet. While there is no proof of fish attending mass, the image stuck, and storytellers repeated it for generations. It made for a better fireside tale, and besides, who wouldn't want to imagine tuna genuflecting politely? The drowned bells also carried social weight. Villagers who lived near the supposed site of the sunken city often used the legend as both a warning and a boast. A warning because the sea might rise again and claim more land. A boast because not every place had bells still calling the faithful from beneath the waves. Travellers reported that locals guided them to cliffs and hushed them at dusk, waiting for the sound to roll upward. Some swore they heard it, others only nodded politely while secretly thinking it was the wind. But once you hear something yourself well, then you are marked by the mystery. Through it all, the Byzantine authorities kept a careful distance. The empire was pragmatic. It needed ships, taxes, and soldiers more than ghost stories. But superstition has a way of sneaking into official records. One late medieval document notes that a bishop warned sailors to avoid the waters of the tolling bells lest they be lured into storms. Whether he meant that literally or metaphorically, no one can say. Yet it shows that even leaders folded the myth into daily life. and so the drowned bells became a kind of watery clock for those who believed. At certain hours, especially in the lull before dawn, they said the tones rose clearest, reminding people of prayer loss and the thin line between land and sea. And as the waves closed again, darkness returned and the bells were swallowed once more. They say the sea listens at night. The monks of the Adriatic certainly believed it, though. Whether they found comfort or dread in that listening is another matter. When the sun slid down behind the stone hills and the sky turned the colour of old parchment, the quiet was broken not only by the wash of waves, but sometimes by the slow, deliberate toll of bells. For the clergy, these phantom sounds seemed to blur the line between earthly duty and divine mystery. For the mariners who spent their lives at the mercy of fickle tides, the tolling became part warning, part lullaby. And for anyone trying to sleep in a coastal town, the bells could be a deeply inconvenient bedtime story. Picture a sailor stumbling up from his hammock aboard a Byzantine merchant vessel. He has spent the evening hauling barrels of olive oil, each one easily weighing about 100 kilograms, 220 pounds into the ship's hold. His back aches, his hands are raw, and all he wants is to close his eyes. Then as the deck creaks beneath him, he hears it a muffled clang rolling through the water, distant but heavy, as if a cathedral lies just below the keel. He shivers, mutters a prayer to St. Nicholas, patron of sailors, and tries not to imagine ghostly congregations waving from the sea floor. The monks told their own versions. In monasteries built close to the shore, novices swore that the bells chimed most often during vigils. Some claimed it was the voices of drowned brothers still calling the faithful to prayer. Others insisted it was a celestial test, a reminder that earthly treasures, even bronze bells carefully hauled up mountains and swung in towers, could vanish in a single storm. Historians still argue whether the monks' reports are records of genuine auditory experiences or allegorical tales written to inspire humility. Yet the persistence of these accounts suggests that at least some of the monks really believed their ears were hearing bronze ringing below the tide. One quirky story from the 11th century describes a mariner who refused to set sail until he had heard the bells 3 nights in a row. Why? Because he believed the drowned monastery beneath the waves was offering him its blessing. He would stand on the shore, arms crossed, waiting for the clang to echo through the dusk. Only after his holy concert did he load his ship with amphorae of wine, each jar holding about 20 litres, a little over 5 gallons, and shove off toward Venice. Whether his voyages were more successful than anyone else's is doubtful, but in the taverns he certainly had the better story. Superstition found an eager audience among sailors who thrived on omens. A falling star could mean luck or doom depending on who you asked. A gull circling the mast might predict a landfall or a storm. Against this backdrop, the phantom bells fit neatly. Mariners often joked that the drowned bells were like the Empire's own timepiece, a reminder that every tide had a schedule. Some crews even tried to chart the hours when the bells sounded most clearly, scratching notes into wax tablets or the margins of ledgers. Their bell charts look suspiciously like tide tables, which suggests they may have been using the legend to disguise practical seamanship. A clever sailor could calculate the best time to pass a strait, and if he wrapped it in the story of ghostly bells, it was simply more fun to share. Of course, there were skeptics even then. A bishop once wrote in his diary that he suspected the sailors heard nothing more than the booming of waves against sea caves. He dryly noted God needs no bronze clappers to make himself known. Still, he stopped short of forbidding the stories, perhaps because even bishops knew better than to rob exhausted sailors of their bedtime mysteries, and perhaps because secretly he too had listened and wondered if the tolling was real. The clergy found the bells a mixed blessing. On one hand, they provided a perfect sermon metaphor, earthly glory sinking yet still echoing from the deep. On the other, the bells unnerved novices, some of whom packed their few belongings and left cloisters after a particularly loud night. Chronicles mention a novice who, upon hearing the bells, insisted that the devil himself was calling monks to a parody of Mass beneath the water. His abbot calmed him, then sent him back to bed with a cup of watered wine. One can only hope the novice slept, though perhaps the real lesson was that even monks sometimes need a nightcap. Foreign mariners added their voices. Venetian captains passing through the Adriatic occasionally recorded the phenomenon in their logs. Some dismissed it as nonsense, blaming overwork and too much cheap wine. Others, perhaps eager to impress patrons back home, described the sounds in florid detail. One Venetian claimed he heard not just bells, but entire chants beneath the waves, as if monks continued their liturgy underwater. Historians still debate whether this account was satire exaggeration, or a genuine misinterpretation of wind and tide. What is clear is that the legend spread far beyond the Greek-speaking world, hitching a ride on merchant vessels like a persistent barnacle. As the stories grew, so did their uses. Mariners began to treat the drowned bells as a kind of maritime lottery. Hear them before departure, good voyage ahead. Hear them mid-journey, trouble brewing. Hear them at landfall, time to kiss the ground and donate to the nearest church. The clergy perhaps reluctantly tolerated this blending of faith and folklore, though one imagines they shook their heads as sailors solemnly lit candles for the drowned bell-ringers. And so, between monks murmuring prayers and mariners whispering omens, the drowned bells became part of the Adriatic's identity. Not every listener heard them, of course. Some nights were silent, others filled only with the hiss of waves. But when the sound did roll up through the water, whether imagined or real, it reminded everyone that the sea was not just a highway of commerce. It was also a keeper of secrets, ringing reminders that faith and fate both lurked beneath the tide. The drowned bells, for all their eerie persistence, were said to belong to a city that no longer breathed air. Somewhere along the ragged edge of the Adriatic coast, a Byzantine settlement sank, swallowed by the sea, with a suddenness that defied ordinary explanation. The monks and mariners whispered of this lost city in hushed tones, partly because they feared divine punishment, and partly because they knew that salt water does not give back what it has taken. The story begins with a community that straddled both the sacred and the practical. The settlement had a monastery with tall towers, their bronze bells calling villagers to prayer at dawn and dusk. Around it stretched a lively harbour filled with fishing boats, merchant vessels, and the chatter of traders bargaining over amphorae of oil and sacks of grain. Archaeologists today might call it a modest coastal town, but in the medieval imagination it was a proud city, a jewel whose people believed themselves guarded by the empire's strength. The Adriatic, however, has no patience for pride. One version of the tale describes a storm so violent that the sea rose like a wall, sweeping over the quay and pulling homes into its frothing mouth. Entire families vanished overnight. The next morning, survivors who had fled inland returned to find that their town was no longer there. In its place stretched only the endless water, with wreckage bobbing like driftwood and gulls circling as if to hold a funeral. The monastery's bells, those trusted markers of time, had gone under with the rest. Yet soon people began to swear that they still heard the bells tolling at dawn, a ghostly reminder that the city's faith had not drowned even if its stones had. Historians still argue whether such a catastrophe could have been an earthquake rather than a storm. The Adriatic sits atop shifting tectonic plates, and records from Constantinople mention tremors shaking the region during the very centuries when the legend first appears. If the ground beneath the settlement had liquefied, entire blocks could have slid into the water, leaving the impression of sudden disappearance. To medieval survivors, though, earthquake and judgment were not mutually exclusive. If the city vanished, then surely God had chosen to sweep it away. Quirky details cling to the story like barnacles. One traveller claimed that the city sank on the very night its people refused to host a wandering saint who sought food and shelter. Another swore that the city's women had turned to singing bawdy songs during a festival, and that the bells tolled themselves in protest before dragging the towers into the sea. These flourishes may have been added by storytellers eager to moralise, but they reflect a medieval habit. Every disaster carried a lesson, and lessons were easier to learn if embroidered with scandal. The bells themselves became the legend's anchor. Survivors told how during quiet evenings inland they still heard the muffled sound of bronze striking bronze. Fishermen claimed that while pulling in their nets, a resonance drifted up through the ropes, vibrating in their hands. Children were warned not to wander near the shore at dusk, lest the drowned bells call them down into the water. Even in later centuries, Venetian records mentioned sailors avoiding the area, preferring to tack an extra 2 kilometres, about 1¼ miles, rather than risk passing directly over the haunted site. Modern science has tried to explain the persistence of these reports. Sound does travel differently underwater, and submerged structures can amplify certain tones. It is not impossible that currents through stone archways might mimic bell chimes. Yet there remains the uncomfortable fact that multiple independent sources, monks, sailors, merchants, described the sounds in similar language across centuries. Either they all misheard the same natural phenomenon, or there was, as believers claimed, something far stranger at work. The Byzantine authorities, practical as ever, treated the lost city with studied caution. Imperial surveyors noted the disappearance of taxable households, but rather than dismissing the stories of bells, they quietly filed them away. Emperors had learned long ago that folklore often travelled faster than their soldiers. To confront a legend too directly was to risk looking foolish. Better to let the mystery stand so long as it did not inspire rebellion or heresy. Still, the story spread. Pilgrims moving between shrines along the coast carried it in their baggage. They would sit by firelight telling each other how an entire city had been dragged under by its own bells. One foreign listener even sketched a fanciful drawing of a church tower poking out of the waves like a lonely mast. It looked suspiciously like a child's doodle, yet centuries later antiquarians mistook it for an eyewitness record. Such is the power of rumour, which grows taller the further it sails from shore. There is even a tale of divers long before proper diving suits existed, who tied stones to their waists and descended into the shallows, hoping to glimpse the ruins. They returned, gasping, swearing that they had touched cold bronze with their fingertips. Whether this was genuine discovery or the byproduct of oxygen deprivation is impossible to know, but the claim added weight to the idea that beneath those waters lay not just empty seabed but walls, arches and bells waiting to be rung by unseen hands. To this day the drowned city is remembered in fragments. Its name has slipped into silence, its location blurred by shifting sands. Yet the notion of a Byzantine port swallowed whole remains irresistible. The empire which once believed itself eternal knew well the fragility of coastlines, and when the bell still rang from the deep tolling, not for the living but for the memory of what was lost, they reminded everyone that time and tide bow to no emperor. The story of the drowned bells might have remained a local curiosity murmured only by Greek monks and fishermen, if not for the Venetians. Venice, with its fingers stretched greedily across the Adriatic, recorded everything: trade ledgers, weather notes, sailors' complaints, even gossip disguised as observation. Among those records, tucked between accounts of salted fish and shipments of timber, appear curious entries about bells tolling from nowhere, chimes echoing across open water where no church spire could be seen. Venetian scribes were not men given to whimsy. They were accountants of empire tallying barrels and coins with a precision that could make even an abacus blush. So when a ledger notes that a crew heard the sound of great bells upon calm seas though no tower stood nearby, it is not easily dismissed. The Adriatic was Venice's highway, and every rumour that might affect trade found its way onto parchment. If a sailor swore the tolling meant storms or shipwreck, the merchant listening carefully might add a note in the margin, not because he believed in ghosts, but because forewarned cargo is better insured cargo. One record from the late 12th century mentions a fleet of galleys carrying wheat. The weather was fair, the wind steady, when suddenly bells rang out beneath the waves so clear that one captain thought they must be passing a monastery hidden by fog. Yet the horizon was empty. Hours later, a squall struck, scattering the ships and soaking their precious cargo. Historians still argue whether this was coincidence or embellishment added after the fact. To the superstitious, the bells were a warning. To the merchants, they were an accounting problem: soggy wheat fetches fewer coins. Another Venetian note describes sailors who heard bells tolling at intervals as though marking canonical hours. Monks on shore would have recognised the pattern instantly: prime terce, sext, none. But these sailors were far from any monastery. Either someone beneath the waves was still keeping holy time, or the Adriatic itself had decided to play priest. A quirky aside in the same margin claims that one sailor tried to whistle along with the tolls only to be struck dumb for 3 days. His companions took this as proof that the bells did not enjoy being mocked. Whether this was divine punishment or simply a sailor suffering a minor stroke, the Venetian clerk wrote it down with equal seriousness. What makes these records fascinating is not just their content but their persistence. They appear in logs over decades entered by different scribes connected to different voyages. Had there been only one account, scholars today might dismiss it as tavern chatter sneaking onto parchment. But when multiple ships crewed by men from different cities report the same uncanny tolling, the mystery hardens into a tradition. Even skeptics must admit that something, whether physical phenomenon or contagious rumour, echoed across those waters. The Venetians, ever pragmatic, began to weave the drowned bells into their navigational lore. Some captains claimed that hearing the bells before departure was good luck, ensuring that cargo would arrive safely. Others warned that the tolls meant storms ahead, and some even turned their ships around rather than risk a voyage. A city that measured success in ducats could hardly afford such hesitation, yet Venice also thrived on spectacle. To sell its image as the mistress of the sea, it embraced every scrap of folklore that could be bent into advantage. If the Adriatic sang with bells, then Venice would claim it as part of her dominion. An especially vivid tale comes from a Venetian pilgrim bound for the Holy Land. He wrote that on a calm night, when the stars hung like lanterns over the masts, he heard bells ringing not only below, but around him, as though the entire sea were a cathedral, and he its tiny worshipper. His words, half devotional, half terrified, carry the quivering awe of a man certain he had brushed against the supernatural. Historians still debate whether this account was embellished to impress patrons back home, but it shows how the drowned bells transcended trade and entered the realm of personal faith. Meanwhile, skeptics offered more mundane explanations. One Venetian official suggested that the sound of large waves crashing into underwater caves could easily mimic the resonance of bells. Another dryly noted that sailors were often drunk, and that wine shipped in barrels weighing nearly 100 litres, about 26 gallons each, was consumed as eagerly as it was transported. If crews believed they heard heavenly chimes while nursing a hangover, perhaps that was punishment enough. Yet despite these objections, the clerks kept writing because rumour has a way of insisting on ink. By the 14th century, Venetian charts began marking certain stretches of the Adriatic with tiny symbols, part warning, part curiosity. A little cross here, a bell-like doodle there, suggesting places where phantom sounds were most often reported. Whether these were meant as navigational aids or simply playful marginalia, no one can say, but they reveal that the drowned bells had become woven into the cartographic imagination. Mariners traced their voyages across maps dotted with phantom tolls as though each bell marked another heartbeat of the sea. One cannot overlook the political edge either. Venice and Byzantium maintained a love-hate relationship, trading silk one year and stabbing each other the next. To the Venetians, repeating tales of drowned Byzantine bells may have carried a hint of mockery. See, they might whisper even their churches collapse into the sea. But the same tales also gave Venetian sailors an aura of mystery, as if they were brave enough to sail where others feared to tread. A merchant might not care for theology, but he knew that a good story could make cargo more memorable. Thus, in the margins of trade, Venice preserved what monks and mariners had already begun the legend of bells tolling beneath medieval Greek waters. The ledgers may have been filled with ducats and cargo counts, but between the lines the Adriatic still sang. For centuries the drowned bells tolled in the imagination of monks, sailors and merchants, but by the late Middle Ages a new question surfaced: could there be a natural explanation? As learning slowly filtered back into Europe, scholars began testing the world with fresh curiosity. Yet even as some reached for reason, others clung stubbornly to mystery. This tension between science and superstition became the next chapter of the drowned bell's strange history. The Adriatic is a peculiar sea. Unlike the open sweep of the Mediterranean, its waters are hemmed by rugged coasts and riddled with caves. Fishermen knew that shouting near a cliff could make the rocks answer with ghostly voices. It was not a great leap to imagine that the sea itself might be capable of similar tricks. The idea that underwater caverns could shape sound like the body of a bell had obvious appeal to the rational mind. Historians still argue whether medieval scholars truly grasped the physics of echo, but even the most sceptical monk could not ignore the eerie boom that rolled through the waves on still nights. By the 14th century, wandering natural philosophers, those restless men who carried notebooks, curiosity and occasionally very bad beards, began proposing explanations. One suggested that shifting rocks on the seabed struck against one another, creating the sound of a clapper in a bell. Another argued that pressure changes inside water-filled caves could cause sudden resonant booms. These were serious attempts, though not entirely convincing. After all, rocks do not toll in neat intervals like matins and vespers, and caves rarely keep time like clockwork monks. A more modern analysis suggests that sound waves travelling through water can be refracted and amplified by submerged structures. If a church or tower truly lay beneath the Adriatic, its arches and vaults might act like enormous resonators, transforming the slap of a wave into something like a bell. Divers today sometimes report hearing strange hums and knocks near ruins, though whether these match the tolling of medieval legend is debatable. The quirky part is that fishermen claim the bells sometimes rang louder when storms were near, as if Neptune himself were warning them of foul weather. Was this simply coincidence or an early form of natural disaster warning system encoded in folklore? Historians still debate the point. Superstition, however, is not so easily dismissed. For locals, the bell's voice was not geology, but theology. To them, the drowned city's bells did not merely ring, they preached. Each toll was a reminder of human frailty, of divine oversight, and of the line between salvation and disaster. One chronicler insisted that ignoring the bells was akin to ignoring scripture. If the sea called you to prayer and you failed to kneel, misfortune was sure to follow. And in fairness, if you lived in a fragile wooden house by the shore, misfortune was usually just one storm away. In taverns, the argument played out with predictable gusto. Sailors, after several mugs of beer, each mug holding about 1 litre, a little over 1 quart, would pound the table and swear that the bells were holy. Why else, one might argue, would they always sound on feast days? A quieter skeptic might point out that feast days usually involved more drinking and less sleep, which hardly sharpened the ears. This would earn him an empty mug tossed his way. Scientific discussion, as ever, was a dangerous sport when practiced among men who thought superstition the safer bet. Monks faced the same divide within their cloisters. Some embraced new learning trickling westward from Arab scholars and Byzantine libraries. They whispered that air trapped in rocks could hum like an organ pipe, or that underwater tremors might mimic bells. Others condemned such talk as heresy, accusing their brothers of reducing divine wonders to pebbles and waves. The abbot's patience was tested nightly, especially when novices reported hearing bells during vigils, and older monks argued whether to credit God or geology. More than one abbot probably wished the bells had stayed silent, if only to preserve peace at supper. One fringe tale tells of a travelling scholar who brought a crude horn, a wooden tube bound with bronze, to the coast. He crouched by the waves, blowing into the horn, hoping to produce a resonance that would match the bells. According to a local chronicle, he managed only to summon a confused herd of goats from the hillside who perhaps mistook his experiment for a call to dinner. The villagers laughed, the scholar sulked, and the drowned bells continued their tolling unbothered. The story reminds us that early science often looks suspiciously like slapstick. Despite such comic moments, the debate mattered. For centuries, people had trusted the drowned bells as omens. Mariners adjusted sails when they heard them. Monks prayed harder. Merchants weighed risk with an ear to the sea. But as rational explanations gained traction, the bells began to lose some of their authority. If they were merely echoes, then perhaps they did not carry warnings from heaven. If they were physics, then superstition had been steering ships all along. Yet for every skeptic who dismissed the bells, another clung to them as proof that the divine still spoke through the deep. Even emperors took notice. One Byzantine official, recorded in a surviving letter, advised his ruler that the drowned bells could be understood as the natural groaning of the sea misheard as holy. Yet in the same breath, he suggested using the story as propaganda, telling the people that God's bells tolled to warn the empire of sin. Practical men, it seems, were willing to let superstition do the hard work of crowd control. So the drowned bells sat balanced between science and superstition. On one hand, the Adriatic's geology offered plausible answers. On the other, faith demanded mysteries too stubborn for reason to untangle. And in the end, most people preferred the mystery. After all, a bell that tolls from the seabed is far more satisfying to imagine than a cave burping at low tide. The Adriatic, restless and glittering under moonlight, had long been a place where sailors tested their courage, monks tested their faith, and merchants tested the limits of their profit. When word of drowned bells spread, it did not take long for people with sharp ears and sharper business sense to discover opportunity. Mysteries, after all, sell just as well as spices and salt. Markets near the coast soon found ways to fold the legend into trade. Fishermen who hauled nets heavy with tuna or anchovy claimed that the catch was larger when the bells had been heard at dawn. Buyers eager to brag about miraculous fish dinners happily paid more for bell-blessed catches. A barrel filled with 40 kilograms, about 88 pounds of salted fish, could fetch a higher price if the vendor swore he heard chimes echoing across the harbour that very morning. Was it proof of divine favour, or merely the natural greed of traders wrapping superstition in salesmanship? Historians still argue whether these accounts are exaggerations or genuine attempts to wring profit from folklore. Shrines multiplied along the coastline, small chapels built of rough stone where sailors and villagers lit candles in honour of the bells. One curious example describes a shrine where worshippers hung tiny bronze models of church bells as offerings. These tokens, sometimes weighing less than 1 kilogram, about 2 pounds, were sold by local smiths at a healthy markup. The economy of the drowned bells thus included not only fish and stories but manufactured faith as well. People would kneel, whisper prayers, and leave a miniature bell behind, hoping it might ring on their behalf beneath the sea. Mystics naturally joined the parade. Wandering seers claimed they could interpret the meaning of each toll. A single strike meant safe passage, 2 meant storms, 3 meant profit, and 4, well, that meant doom of course, and also that you should hire the mystic again for a small fee. These men and women often carried talismans, seashells strung on cords or stones, painted with crude crosses which they sold as protection. A charm the size of a fist might weigh half a kilogram, a little over 1 pound, yet was said to keep an entire crew safe from shipwreck. No ship's master wanted to risk ignoring such promises, even if he suspected the mystic would spend his coin at the tavern. Merchants adapted the story with a different kind of cleverness. In Venice, some traders advertised their wares as from the waters of the tolling bells, as though the goods carried a mystical blessing. A bale of silk, perhaps weighing 30 kilograms, about 66 pounds, seemed more exotic when accompanied by the whispered claim that it had travelled across haunted waters. Customers, even the sceptical ones, leaned in with interest. A bargain gained more lustre if it came with a tale worth retelling over supper. Quirky anecdotes abound. One chronicle mentions a monk who began selling small bottles of seawater, insisting they contained the resonance of the bells. Pilgrims dutifully purchased them, some sprinkling drops on their food, others dabbing it on their foreheads. Unsurprisingly, the monk retired comfortably, proving that faith can sometimes season bread better than salt. Another story tells of a mystic who set up a tent by the docks and claimed he could summon the drowned bells on command. He would strike a hidden gong, and though the deception was laughable, sailors paid to watch and gasped all the same. Still, not all commerce was light-hearted. In some villages, the bells were linked to fearful prophecy. If the sound grew louder, people whispered of famine or plague. A merchant arriving to find a town convinced of looming disaster often found his goods worthless, as no one wanted to buy when the end seemed near. On such occasions, the drowned bells depressed the economy as easily as they inflated it. Even emperors, pragmatic as they were, recognised this risk. Records hint at officials instructing clerics to calm the people, reminding them that markets cannot thrive when fear tolls louder than coin. Mysticism also entered diplomacy. Byzantine envoys once warned Venetian captains that the drowned bells were omens of God's displeasure with their greed. The message was clear: share profits more generously or risk storms. Whether or not the bells had rung, the accusation carried weight. Political negotiations often borrow whatever superstition is most convenient, and in this case the Adriatic's phantom chimes became another weapon in the arsenal of rhetoric. Even common sailors, those who had little money to spare, found ways to profit. Some carved trinkets out of driftwood, tiny crosses, bells, or ships, claiming they were shaped under the sound of the bells. These souvenirs sold in port towns could buy an extra loaf of bread or a jug of wine. A jug might hold 3 litres, a little under 1 gallon, enough to brighten an evening. And if the trinket cracked or warped, the buyer simply muttered that the drowned bells had chosen poorly. Historians still debate whether belief drove the economy or whether the economy drove belief. Did people truly hear the bells, or did they simply claim to knowing that every toll meant profit for markets and mystics alike? The line blurred so easily that one wonders if it mattered. The legend wrapped in trade became self-sustaining. Each merchant who sold fish or silk with the story attached helped ensure the bells tolled again in the imagination of the next listener. Thus, the drowned bells, once a haunting omen, became a currency of their own. They purchased food shrines and prophecy. They paid the wages of smiths and seers, monks and mystics. And though the sound itself may have come from nothing more than shifting waves through stone, its echo was minted into coin tolling for both faith and fortune along the medieval Adriatic. Byzantine emperors were many things: ambitious, paranoid, pragmatic, and occasionally very fond of shiny hats, but foolish they were not. When word of the drowned bells echoed along the Adriatic, the empire's rulers recognised both a danger and an opportunity. Superstition could spread unrest like fire through dry straw, but it could also be bent, reshaped, and used as a tool to reinforce authority. In this way, the drowned bells were drafted into imperial politics, their tolls echoing not only across the sea, but through the corridors of Constantinople itself. The emperors knew their people lived half in the world of fact and half in the world of symbol. A harvest was not just a harvest, it was God's approval. A storm was not just bad weather, it was judgment. And bells, those resonant bronze mouths, had long been instruments of both timekeeping and theology. When bells tolled from beneath the sea, emperors saw more than mystery, they saw a ready-made sermon. One ruler is said to have proclaimed that the Adriatic's bells tolled as a warning to repent, to pay taxes dutifully, and to remember that even the strongest cities could be swallowed without notice. Convenient perhaps, but effective. Church leaders joined in, though, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some bishops insisted the bells were divine instruments rung by angels beneath the waters to remind Byzantines of humility. Others warned that they might be demonic trickery luring the faithful toward despair. Historians still argue whether synods seriously debated the origin of the bells, or whether such disputes were left to gossip and tavern tables. Either way, sermons across the empire began to borrow the image: as the bells toll from the deep, so does God call from beyond your sight. Practical officials also recognized the bells as useful leverage in diplomacy. When Venetian traders pressed too hard for lower tariffs, Byzantine negotiators sometimes reminded them that God's bells rang in Greek waters, not Venetian ones. Was it theology or intimidation? Likely both. The message was simple: divine omens belong to the empire, and foreign merchants should tread carefully. Quirky accounts survive of emperors themselves listening for the bells. One story claims that an emperor ordered a group of divers, hardly more than fishermen, with stones strapped to their waists to descend into the Adriatic and report back. They returned, gasping and half-drowned, swearing they had touched cold bronze in the dark. Another tale insists an emperor had a model bell cast weighing about 200 kilograms, roughly 440 pounds, and lowered it into a cistern to test whether water could truly carry sound. The experiment proved little, except that the bell cracked when struck too hard, but it gave courtiers something to gossip about for weeks. The drowned bells also entered political prophecy. Court astrologers already busy with comets and eclipses claimed the tolling foretold shifts in power. If the bells rang clear, the emperor's reign would endure. If they sounded muffled, rebellion brewed. Such predictions, conveniently vague, could be reshaped after the fact to make astrologers look wise. One court poet even declared the Adriatic tolls not for the sea but for the throne, a line that earned him a small pension, and many eye rolls from the less poetic members of court. Meanwhile, church leaders leveraged the legend to demand greater devotion. Bishops instructed coastal congregations to increase their prayers whenever the bells were heard. Some ordered processions to the shore where icons were dipped into the water, as if to bless the drowned city below. An account from the 13th century describes villagers carrying candles to the cliffs at dusk, their flames flickering in the sea breeze, chanting hymns, until the waves themselves seemed to answer with a deep metallic note. Whether that sound was genuine or imagined, the ritual bound the community together under church authority. Yet not all political uses were so pious. Tax collectors sometimes reminded reluctant villagers that ignoring imperial demands was risky. When bells tolled from drowned churches, "Pay today," they warned, "or the sea may come for you tomorrow." One suspects that these officials heard more coins than chimes, but the tactic worked. A family weighing whether to surrender grain might decide that risking divine wrath was worse than parting with supper. In this way, bronze that had sunk to the seabed continued to fill imperial coffers. The drowned bells also reached the ears of foreign diplomats. Ambassadors from the Holy Roman Empire reported hearing the stories and wondered aloud whether Byzantium used them as propaganda. Crusaders passing through sometimes carried tales back to France or England, embellishing them with flourishes about underwater choirs and angelic warnings. These retellings gave the bells international fame, and Byzantium benefited from the aura of mystery. After all, an empire touched by miracles, however eerie, carried a kind of prestige in a medieval world hungry for signs of the divine. Historians still debate how seriously emperors themselves believed in the bells. Some likely dismissed them as legend but understood their propaganda value. Others, steeped in a world where miracles and disasters walked hand in hand, may have truly paused in their gilded halls when reports arrived from the Adriatic. After all, emperors had every reason to be superstitious. Thrones in Constantinople were famously unsteady. If a bell could vanish into the sea overnight, why not a dynasty? Even in decline, the empire used the drowned bells as a moral compass. As borders shrank and enemies pressed closer, sermons reminded the faithful that pride leads to ruin. The bells, it was said, were the voice of a city that thought itself eternal, but was humbled by the tide. To hear them was to remember that nothing, neither marble nor empire nor emperor, lasts forever. a comforting message for bishops, perhaps less so for the emperors themselves. Thus the drowned bells rippled outward into politics and faith alike. They tolled for taxes, for sermons, for diplomacy, and for fear. Bronze had sunk into salt water, but its echoes rose into law and prayer. The emperors of Byzantium, ever pragmatic, understood the lesson: when the sea gives you mystery, use it. And so the Adriatic kept tolling not just in the ears of sailors, but in the policies of an empire always balancing between survival and collapse. Foreign ears always seem to sharpen local legends, stretching them taller, polishing them stranger, until the tale that returns home is hardly the one that sets sail. The drowned bells of the Adriatic were no exception. Pilgrims, crusaders, wandering scholars and merchants who brushed against the story carried it across Europe, each adding flourishes as freely as a cook adds salt. What began as a local warning about a vanished Byzantine port became, in the mouths of outsiders, a chorus of mysteries ringing across Christendom. Imagine the scene: a French pilgrim bound for the Holy Land stands on a creaking Venetian galley, the Adriatic calm and glassy around him. He leans over the rail, hears a deep boom rising from beneath the hull, and startles as though the sea itself has spoken. By the time he reaches Jerusalem, the tale has grown. He tells fellow pilgrims not of one muffled toll, but of entire liturgies sung beneath the waves, choirs of ghostly monks processing through drowned chapels with candles that never sputter. A simple clang refracted by water, and imagination blossoms into an underwater cathedral. Crusaders were no less inventive. Passing through on their way east, they carried the bells into campfire talk. One knight, perhaps to impress squires, claimed that the bells were the voices of martyrs lost at sea demanding vengeance against unbelievers. Another suggested they tolled whenever a Christian army was destined to win. His companions raised eyebrows, especially since the bells often rang just before they lost a battle. Historians still argue whether Crusader chronicles mentioning seaborne bells were sincere reports, or playful jabs at fellow knights who mistook thunder for theology. English pilgrims, unused to Mediterranean strangeness, gave the bells even more embellishment. A Canterbury monk recorded in his diary that he heard not just bells, but the clatter of ghostly hooves as though drowned horses galloped across the seabed. It reads less like history and more like the product of too much wine, yet the diary was copied and passed around abbeys, spreading the legend deeper into northern Europe. Soon the drowned bells were joined by drowned stables, drowned feasts, even drowned kings who supposedly still held court below. A quirky imagination had turned a chime into a kingdom. German travellers added their own Teutonic severity. One merchant from Lübeck swore that the tolling was God's judgment upon greed, and he returned home warning that merchants who cheated customers would hear bells beneath their beds at night. Unsurprisingly, he also opened a shop selling small bronze bells, each about 15 centimetres high, weighing 2 kilograms, a little over 4 pounds, as talismans to ward off dishonesty. Whether customers bought them for piety or novelty, his business prospered. Thus, even in far-off markets, the Adriatic's tolling found ways to fatten purses. Spanish pilgrims, fiery in imagination, embroidered the tale with prophecy. One claimed the bells rang louder whenever empires were about to crumble. When he returned to Toledo, he swore to anyone who would listen that the muffled toll he heard beneath the waves predicted the fall of Jerusalem itself. Another Spaniard insisted that when he dipped his hand into the sea, the water vibrated like a struck bell tingling up his arm. People listened, half sceptical, half delighted, because prophecy always sells better than explanation. Venetian hosts encouraged these embellishments, knowing that pilgrims and foreigners carried stories like bees carry pollen. A well-placed tale over supper could travel all the way to Paris, embroidered with each retelling. Foreigners eager to impress audiences at home leaned into exaggeration. Some drew crude sketches of underwater monasteries' towers rising from the seabed monks, floating serenely with candles that somehow burned underwater. The sketches were more fantasy than record, but they made excellent souvenirs for storytellers back home. Historians still debate whether these foreign accounts corrupted the original legend or merely enriched it. Some argue that without pilgrims and crusaders, the story would have withered on the vine of local folklore. Others believe the outsiders' additions muddied the tale beyond recognition, turning a haunting maritime mystery into a carnival of impossible details. Either way, the drowned bells became more famous abroad than at home. When northern Europeans spoke of Byzantium, they often mentioned the strange bells first, as if the empire's politics and theology mattered less than the echo of bronze beneath the sea. The legend also seeped into art. In a Florentine manuscript, a miniature depicts ghostly monks raising bells from waves, halos glimmering like goldfish in sunlight. A troubadour in Provence sang verses about the tolling sea, his refrain declaring that bells of the East call men to the cross. Even a few Icelandic sagas already fond of sea ghosts included stray lines about bells heard far to the south, where the sea speaks with iron tongues. Quirky as these inclusions were, they show how foreign travellers scattered the bells across the cultural map of medieval Europe. For locals along the Adriatic, this exaggeration was both amusing and frustrating. Villagers chuckled when pilgrims described underwater choirs, but frowned when crusaders turned the bells into weapons of propaganda. Some coastal towns worried that foreign obsession might invite more dangerous attention. After all, if outsiders thought treasure lay beneath the sea, why wouldn't they dive in with nets and greed? In this way, myth invited the possibility of intrusion, a reminder that stories once released cannot be recalled. Still, the drowned bells endured ringing differently in every tongue. To French pilgrims they were hymns, to German merchants they were warnings, to Spanish travellers they were vibrations of prophecy, to English monks they were entire drowned courts rattling in the dark. Each culture draped the sound in its own colours, ensuring that no single explanation could silence the mystery. And so the Adriatic tolls stretched beyond Greek waters, echoing in abbeys, markets and castles, far removed from the sea that first carried them. By the late medieval centuries, the drowned bells of the Adriatic had ceased to be just a fisherman's tale whispered over nets, or a monk's warning murmured in candlelight. They had drifted into the quieter but no less passionate world of scholarly debate. In monasteries, courts, and eventually the fledgling universities of Europe, men with ink-stained fingers and restless minds began quarrelling over what exactly the tolling meant. Some insisted it was proof of divine intervention, others argued for natural explanations, and a growing minority suggested that the entire thing was little more than folklore polished into tradition. The most devout thinkers clung to the story of a sunken monastery. According to them, a holy community had vanished one night, pulled beneath the waves by storm or earthquake, yet its bells continued to ring as part of an eternal vigil. One chronicle even described the drowned monks as choirmen of the abyss, their prayers rising in muffled tones each dawn and dusk. Such imagery appealed deeply to believers, the idea that faith could survive even the swallowing sea. For them, the tolling bells were not just echoes, they were sermons, reminders that piety lived on even where walls and towers could not. Other scholars sought explanations rooted in the restless nature of the Adriatic itself. They noted how the seabed shifted with earthquakes and how underwater caves and arches could funnel waves into strange resonances. A stone corridor beneath the waves might transform a crashing surf into something suspiciously like a bell. One Byzantine writer compared it to the way a jug of wine hums when air is blown across its lip. If a ceramic amphora holding about 20 litres 5 gallons could sing when played with, then why not the cavernous hollows of the sea? Historians still argue whether these scholars were genuinely close to grasping acoustic science, or whether they simply stumbled upon metaphors that seemed clever. Then there were the skeptics, a rare breed in an age when mystery usually trumped logic. They argued that the bells were not sounds at all but stories, tales born to explain catastrophe. A city vanishes overnight, swallowed by storm or quake, and grief demands an explanation. The drowned bells said these skeptics were a narrative balm, a way to give voice to loss, and turn chaos into something almost orderly. They warned that listeners who expected to hear bells would eventually convince themselves they had, even if all the sea offered was the groan of shifting waves or the crash of surf in a hollow cavern. In modern terms, we might call it suggestion, or even mass psychology. A few theories reached the edges of eccentricity. One chronicler suggested that whales were to blame their low calls distorted into bell-like tones by the water. Another, less zoologically minded, insisted that the devil himself rang counterfeit bells beneath the sea to mock the faithful. His colleagues rolled their eyes, but the idea found popularity in pulpits where fiery sermons always needed a villain. If Satan can ring bells, one preacher thundered, then he can summon souls too. It was dramatic enough to keep villagers awake at night, though perhaps not for the intended reasons. The debates were not just theological, but also political. Scholars tied to imperial courts had to tread carefully. One court historian argued that the bells were the groaning of the sea misheard as holiness. only to be quietly reprimanded for diminishing what the emperor himself occasionally used as an omen in speeches. Another scribe, eager to please, penned lines describing the bells as God's bronze heralds, a phrase that promptly made its way into sermons and tax decrees alike. If the sea itself told for obedience who was a peasant to argue with imperial tax collectors, quirky anecdotes emerged from the universities of Western Europe as well. In Paris, a lecturer used the drowned bells as an example of faulty sensory perception, warning students that ears betray as swiftly as eyes. In Oxford, a scholar wrote a long treatise comparing the Adriatic bells to the famous Antikythera mechanism, claiming both were examples of hidden wisdom locked in metal. His logic was thin, but the treatise was copied and circulated, showing how the legend migrated into intellectual circles hungry for exotic case studies. Comparisons to other mysteries also enriched the debate. Some writers linked the drowned bells to the famous Phaistos disc from Crete, another puzzle of Greek origin that refused to yield a clear explanation. Others invoked tales of relics that sang, or statues that wept, arguing that the Adriatic bells belonged to this wider category of divine wonders. The skeptic camp, never content to remain quiet, countered that such comparisons proved nothing except that humans were remarkably good at inventing marvels to fill gaps in understanding. Historians still debate whether these cross-references helped keep the legend alive or diluted it into yet another curiosity among many. Within monasteries, the disputes could become heated. One novice recorded that his abbot scolded him for dismissing the bells as echoes. "If the sea speaks," the abbot said sternly, "you listen." But in another monastery, a different abbot chuckled and told his brothers not to fear noises in the night, for if bells ring underwater, then fish must also attend mass. That line was repeated for generations, a rare moment when humour slipped into otherwise serious theological reflection. Ultimately, no consensus was reached. Scholars split into camps: the devout who saw drowned monks faithfully tolling, the naturalists who saw geology and acoustics at work, and the skeptics who saw the power of story itself shaping perception. Each argument had its champions, each its critics, and none managed to silence the others. The Adriatic, meanwhile, continued to toll whenever it pleased, indifferent to parchment quarrels. The debates around the drowned bells reflect a broader truth about the medieval world. It stood at the crossroads between faith and reason, superstition and science, story and evidence. Bells that rang from beneath the sea became more than a mystery. They became a stage on which competing worldviews clashed. Were they miracles? Were they nature misunderstood? Or were they myths given flesh by fear and imagination? Scholars quarrelled, wrote and rewrote, but the waves kept their secret. And so the Adriatic continued its tolling, serenading not just sailors and monks, but the very people who tried hardest to explain it away. Centuries pass, empires buckle, and maps change their borders like tired clothes. Yet the drowned bells of the Adriatic keep a stubborn place in memory. The empire that once lit their towers fades into fresco dust, but the story survives, carried by sailors in rough wool, by monks with quiet eyes, and by modern travellers who come armed with cameras, headphones, and a desire to be haunted safely before bedtime. The sea hums its old tune, and people still lean over railings, stilling their breath, hoping the water will speak. Early modern tinkerers, convinced that courage plus rope equals discovery, lower themselves by hand from skiffs. They tie stones to their waists and sink in quick, brave plunges, popping back up with claims of shadowed walls and archways where light sluices like pale silk. One man swears he felt bronze cold as winter on his fingertips. Another insists he heard a single patient toll, as if the deep had tried one note, decided the audience was not worth the full programme, and retreated to its rehearsal cave. Historians still argue whether these are genuine encounters or atmospheric enhancements supplied by fear, coughs and imagination. In the 19th century, romantic sensibilities adopt the bells as a pet melancholy. Painters spread blue upon blue temples, bloom underwater, and monks glide serenely among fish, the size of polished shields. Poets describe the tolling as a heartbeat kept by the sea on behalf of a vanished city, which is gorgeous and also extremely unhelpful for navigation. Tourists buy prints and go home declaring that the Adriatic sings of pride and loss, which it may, though it also sings of tides, taxes and damp socks left too near the rail. The legend takes on that particular glow only nostalgia can lacquer. Modern curiosity arrives with equipment and clipboards. Oceanographers tow hydrophones along cables 200 metres long, about 656 feet, listening for low booms in submarine caverns. Side-scan sonar sweeps the seafloor in crisp ribbons, recording ridges and thickets of rock that might once have been walls. On a few tapes, a deep resonance surfaces something like a bell, if the bell were shy and speaking through a winter scarf. Skeptics shrug and call it ordinary acoustics. Locals nod gravely and say, "There you are," in the tone of people who have been patiently waiting for science to catch up since the invention of sandals. Divers come with better gear and colder noses. They descend carrying air cylinders of 12 litres, about 3 1/5 gallons, regulators hissing like mild serpents, and lights that slice the green into neat slabs. They brush past rough stone blocks, count paces that feel longer underwater, and report temperatures between 8 degrees Celsius and 15 degrees Celsius, between 46 degrees Fahrenheit and 59 degrees Fahrenheit, that creep under their wetsuits like polite ghosts with chilly fingers. One diver swears he hears 3 chimes while at 20 metres, about 66 feet. His partner hears nothing at all, and later claims the only toll was the coffee bill. Both understand that the sea is sly and that stories are louder in the head than in the ears. On shore, the legend turns into livelihood without losing its dignity. Craft stalls sell miniature bronze bells no higher than 10 centimetres, about 4 inches each, weighing around 200 grams, about 7 ounces polished, until they hold a coin-sized sun. Guides lead evening walks along promenades that stretch for 2 kilometres, about 1¼ miles, pausing at overlooks where wind flutes through cracks and does a convincing impression of sacred metallurgy. A child holds her small bell to the air and swears it hums back. Her grandfather smiles because sometimes belief is the better souvenir. A restaurateur prints bells beneath on his menu beside the grilled fish. He will not confirm whether the recipe requires a toll per fillet and a tithe for the lemon. Mystics adapt with entrepreneurial briskness. One offers guided meditations timed to the waves, promising that if a listener breathes slowly enough, the drowned bells will answer at the edge of sleep. Another sells waxed cord bracelets knotted in patterns, meant to echo campanile ropes. The knots do not toll, but they do make satisfying loops when worn beside a watch. A third, more theatrical soul insists that the bells ring louder if a person has recently done a good deed. His clients arrive the next day with suspiciously generous receipts from bakeries and bookshops. Bless him, he has found a superstition that improves local commerce. Museums join the quiet chorus. In glass cases they display Venetian ledgers that mention bells heard far from towers, their brown ink still steady and businesslike. There are maps with small hand-drawn symbols where the sea is rumoured to sing, and letters from bishops who counsel sailors to pray without abandoning common sense, which is also a useful policy for kitchen fires and marriage. A placard reminds visitors of a mainstream historical fact. The city of Constantinople falls in the year 1453, and yet the Greek imagination continues migrating into villages' harbours, and stories like a candle carried through storm. If empire can end and memory can persist, perhaps bells can drown and still speak. Underwater archaeology offers comparisons. People point to the Antikythera mechanism found in 1900, proof that the sea archives marvels with an unhelpful filing system. Others mention the Phaistos disc, whose symbols resist confident translation even on dry land. If such puzzles can survive, why not a bell's rumour? Historians still argue whether similar acoustic effects occur near other submerged ruins, if currents tapping stone can mimic a monk's order to rise and pray. The conversation meanders pleasantly between hydrodynamics and theology, like cousins who disagree at dinner but refuse to leave early because the olives are excellent. Meanwhile, the coast keeps its rituals. Old men listen at dusk the way their grandfathers did. Young couples make small promises to return in a year and test the water's voice again. Cats in harbours stalk along walls, pausing as if they too sense the timeline stacked beneath the waves. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier nights? That old blend of seriousness and absurdity is here as well. People fold earnest reverence into casually comic habits, because living beside mystery requires both posture and grin. Sometimes the bells are quiet for weeks. Then a windless evening settles. The sea lies flat as dark glass, and someone hears a low boom travel like a careful thought. The sound might be a swell coaxed through a grotto, or the groan of rock easing against its neighbour. It might be imagination returning a story to its source, or it might be something that refuses ordinary names. A listener glances down as if a tower waits politely below for the congregation to arrive. Another smiles and says nothing, because not every beauty benefits from being explained. So the drowned bells keep their two truths sound and symbol. The physical world offers its explanations. The human world offers its meanings. Between them stands the old habit of listening in the evening and letting the sea decide whether to perform. Perhaps the deep rings bronze. Perhaps it rings memory. Either way, the note travels outward along the surface and inward along the ribs, and people sleep better knowing that what is lost is not entirely mute. Now the coast grows quieter. Waves fold and refold themselves with a patience older than stones, and the air cools as though someone draws a soft curtain over the day. Lanterns glow along the harbour, little moons resting at shoulder height, and somewhere a shutter taps once and then decides it has said enough. If you listen, the shore seems to answer itself. Rope against wood, water against rock, breath against breath. Let the story sink gently. The bells you have been following, sometimes sound, sometimes symbol, grow distant not because they tire, but because they understand your eyes are heavy. They step back into the deep and keep their small vigil without you for a while. You are invited to rest. Breathe in as if the wind has been washed and cooled for you. Breathe out as if you are returning something borrowed slow and grateful. With each breath, your shoulders loosen, your jaw remembers the shape of ease, and your thoughts begin to sway like boats that no longer need to mind the tide. The sea has carried emperors, merchants, monks, and stories. It can carry your worries for a few quiet hours. Picture the surface smoothing until the stars have a mirror and the mirror does not flinch. Beneath it, bells real or remembered become a hush that steadies the pulse. They do not warn now, they cradle. They do not demand now, they accompany. If a sound rises, it is as soft as a fingertip on a book's last page. You're almost asleep. The harbour, the cliffs, the long water, the far horizon, all of it remains patient and sure. Let the night keep watch. Let the sea keep time. Let the bells, wherever they are, toll only the hour of rest, and let that hour be long and kind and yours.